If I may welcome you, it's really great to have you here. My name is Michael Rice. The only reason why I'm standing up to introduce Jim and to welcome you is at the moment I happen to be president of the ISSR. And indeed, as I think probably all of you know, this is an ISSR organised conference. Now that leads me seamlessly, speaking slightly informally, the fact that those of us who are gathered here today may conceivably be the people who forever will be able to say that we were at the last ISSR organised conference. In the sense that what ISSR is really an elite academy. We are not a group of professional conference organisers, as one or two of you may have even spotted. So I want to say a huge number of thanks, particularly to the trio of Fraser Watts, who is our Executive Secretary, to Harris Wiseman, there he is sitting at the back, Harris Wiseman, who until recently was the official administrator for the ISSR, and to Anthony Ned, who has fortunately taken over seamlessly from Harris and is our present administrator, and is normally based in Toronto, so we're really glad that you're here. We do, by the way, as well as being the Elite Academy, have what are called associate members. So for anybody here who's not a fellow of the ISSR, but who sort of feels comfortable with how the conference is going intellectually and thinks they might be interested in knowing what an associate member really is, please ask probably either Fraser or myself at some point. The conference theme is evolution, religion and social bonding, and we've got a mixture of people who've submitted invited talks, those of us who are just attending and listening, and as you know there are some plenary sessions, some parallel sessions and a number of keynotes. And the reason for that title is both that it's intrinsically interesting and worthwhile, but it also relates to a grant that the ISSR has had, and the grant is basically organised around Robin Dunbar's social brain hypothesis, and Robin will be here for part of the conference. And that's a 3-year Templeton Religious Trust funded project. And one of the nice things about getting grants is you end up having advisory committees and meeting lots of people both working on the grant and people like Jim who sat on the advisory committee. And Jim, some of you will know already, is a distinguished professor, which for those who don't know is a proper American term, at Rutgers, and has 2 doctorates, one with his 2 earned doctorates, we won't get on to anything to do with honorary awards, but he's 2 earned doctorates, one in philosophy of religion and one in psychology. And I've read 2 of Jim's books, which are absolutely wonderful, and I can recommend them very strongly. One is called Blood That Cries Out from the Earth, and the other is called Terror and Transformation. And they're those sorts of books that are both truly academic books, and they include new thinking, new scholarship, are utterly on top of literature, but are genuinely wonderfully readable. Okay. Jim's going to speak to us now, and then depending on timing, we'll have
whole body activity spreading across different perceptual and motoric brain regions. Our actual sensory experience and our conceptualizations of it are always mediated neurologically and bodily and cognitively. We cannot possibly be conscious of all the sights, sounds, smells, thoughts, sensations, feelings, all that impinges on us. Normally, only those stimuli that we can attend to or have cognitive schema for enter into our experience. Our mind can never produce a complete, multidimensional, cognitive representation of the world. The maps of our experience are not direct representations, but are the product of dynamic interactions among our actions, our physiology, and our cognitive processing systems. Such maps or schemas in turn influence what we see and don't see, what thoughts and feelings are engendered. So perception and sensation are not simple, direct phenomena. They may seem simple and direct when we look at a tree, but research from neurology and cognitive science uncovers processes implicated in our sensory awareness that are anything but simple and direct. Rather, experiencing in both science and religion is multimodal and probably non-linear, processes brought about through bodily activity. Thus, bodily activity, such as ritual, has the potential to bring about a transformation and perhaps even an expansion of our ordinary sensory and cognitive processes. Use of different postures, breathing exercises, movements of various kinds, and perhaps visualization, long history in the religions of humankind. Religious understanding is not abstract ratiocination, posture, breathing, movement, sight, smiles, sounds that engage all the senses, along with bodily metaphors. All that enters into our religious speech. Proprioception also can figure into religious knowing. Many meditative techniques, as well as certain psychotherapeutic ones, and bodily practices like yoga or martial arts facilitate and deepen our proprioception. These disciplines explicitly or implicitly expand and deepen our sensory capacities and our bodily awareness, and make us more sensitive to increasing subtle proprioceptive sensations and sensory inputs. This in turn influences the information we receive and how it is processed. So ritual activity has the potential to provide its own sensory inputs in ways of processing information. Let's see if I get this to go. Good. Part 2. When I was being trained in clinical neuropsychology in the 1980s, the reigning paradigm there concerned exclusively the issue of localization. And this made good sense, since determining where a brain lesion was located was crucial for diagnosis and treatment. But the assumption was that symptoms were caused by trauma to a specific part of the brain. But this drive for localization was not simply powered by clinical concerns. It also fit in with a widespread reductionistic model of scientific investigation that was always looking for simpler, more precise underlying causes. So the loss of speech was said to result from trauma to Broca's area. Or vision problems probably indicated the patient had issues in the occipital cortex in the back of the head. But even this singular focus on localization was being challenged even back then. In a series of studies on the sense of smell starting in the 1970s, using EEG readings of the electrical activity in the brain, Walter Freeman and his group found that information was contained not in the firing of individual neurons, but in the amplitude of the wave produced when all the neurons in the olfactory bulb fired in a particular pattern. Identifying a specific smell was not done by a specific neuron or subset of neurons specialized for that particular odor, but rather is accomplished by every olfactory neuron firing together to produce a wave with a certain configuration. The meaning of the sensation resides in that global neuronal activity, not the firing of individual neurons. These signals are then sent throughout the brain and combined with input from other senses and memories of past events and the interaction of neurons in the olfactory bulb, combined with information from other senses and stored from information from the past. Together, all of this produces an experience unique to the individual. The smell of bacon and eggs cooking instantly triggers images of bacon strips and fried eggs, and that evokes happiness in one hungry child and revulsion in another vegan adult. Freeman argues that the neurology of sensation seems better represented by nonlinear dynamical models than models of linear causation, where a particular sight or smell always produces the same neuronal effect. In nonlinear dynamical systems, there are continually shifting patterns, in this case neurons firing, that are constrained within certain limits. From these continually reciprocating processes, new stimulations coming into the brain, neighboring neurons firing, etc. From all of this emerges those sensations that we experience as smell, taste, or sight. In the 1980s, I remember the way in which clinical diagnosis of neurological pathologies was done through a combination of intense clinical interviews, physical exams, and paper and pencil tests. With the arrival of CT, or CAT scans, much more precise localization of tumors or aneurysms became possible. Basically, an X-ray of the brain, CAT scans produce a static image. The more precise but static images produced by CAT scans reinforce the focus on localization as the only, quote, scientific way to understand the brain. Later, fMRI technology traced blood flow to various parts of the brain and thus produced a dynamic picture of neural activity. The dynamic and dramatic and colorful fMRI slides, they soon became de rigueur in neuroscience articles, only added to the singular focus on localization. It also added to the expense of producing neurological articles, but that's a different matter. As parts of the brain were said to light up that has become more colorful on a computer screen is blood flow or oxygen consumption shifted from one place to another as the subject was performing certain cognitive tasks. But as we all and everyone in this room knows, frames of reference allow us to see some things and blind us to others. The fact that some parts of the brain received increased blood flow and oxygen during certain tasks did not logically entail that the rest of the brain was necessarily dormant or irrelevant to the task. Looked at through a singular localization lens, the brain scan might look that way. But that conclusion was not necessarily the whole story. At one level, there are areas in the brain that are particularly active during certain tasks: speaking, reading, understanding speech, decoding visual signals, experiencing fear, and so on. But that does not logically entail that they are, quote, specialized for that task, or that other areas are not equally crucial or also involved in the same task. Some recent research suggests that that is the case. One example. The classic case for the localization of emotion was the amygdala in the brain as the seat of fear. Individuals with amygdala damage show lower responses to fear in adverse situations. They're less able to feel fear in normally fearful situations, and they're less able to perceive fear in others. Electrical stimulation of the amygdala produces fear behavior and increased startle reaction in rats. Now, while the amygdala is certainly involved in fear processing, further research finds that it's equally involved in processing perception, attention, a variety of domains of social cognition and memory formation and retrieval, regardless of whether the material is emotionally salient or not. The amygdala is also actively involved in positive reinforcement and positive expectancies and processing novel experiences. The amygdala also regulates sensory processing, especially the value and salience of sensory experience. So the amygdala plays a crucial role in perception and other sensory information. There is little evidence that the amygdala is specialized for processing fear or any other particular content. Rather, it appears that the amygdala is just one part of a much larger network that is involved not just in processing fear, but also in various proprioceptive and orienting tasks, especially parsing ambiguous stimuli and social cognition. But no nodes in this network, including the amygdala, are exclusively processing fear or other emotions. And most are also involved in non-fear-related and non-emotionally undertaken tasks. Several such distributed and more general function networks have been identified using brain imagery tools. These are often called resting state networks because they are investigating using an fMRI that's in a resting state. That is, the subject is not performing a task at that moment. Under these, quote, resting conditions, these networks still show correlated oscillations and maintain their functional cognitivity even at rest. Because the subject is not performing a task, it is assumed that these network patterns emerge spontaneously and so represent the uninfluenced and foundational state of the brain. Now it's tempting to simply move the localization model to the network level and argue that these so-called intrinsic networks are the sites specialized for specific functions. But that seems way oversimplified. Several different networks work together in many common tasks. Conversely, as we've seen with the amygdala, a particular neural locale may play a role in more than one such network. By definition, a network involves more than just one area of the brain, and each network includes portions of other networks. Likewise, particular mental activities are also widely distributed over several networks. In fact, it appears that all the networks are involved in all our mental activities to a more or less extent. It's been theorized that the differences among our mental activities are primarily a result of the relative involvement of different networks and the ratio between them. The result is a highly distributed and interconnected, rather than a discretely localized model of how the brain works. One striking implication of this research is that there is no fundamental, by that I mean neurological difference between cognition and emotion. Many of the same networks subtend both activities that we categorize as emotional and that we categorize as cognitive. And the brain scans of individuals undergoing, quote, emotional experiences show increased activity in networks associated with the simulation of past experience, language, retrieval of semantic information, and executive attention, That is, show activation in activities that we usually label as, quote, cognitive. This model is not simply that, quote, affect impacts cognition, a phraseology that suggests that cognition is primary in human understanding and affect is secondary and simply acts upon cognition. Rather, what we call cognition and affect are reciprocally bound together in every moment of human understanding, including scientific and religious understanding. Every emotional experience has its cognitive component. Every cognitive process, no matter how formal or abstract, has its affective dimension. Such a holistic approach gains additional support from a recently completed massive research project called the Human Connectome Project. This 5-year, multi-million-dollar, largely funded by the NIH, involves 39 investigators in 11 institutions in the USA and Europe. All of them utilize the most advanced tools available for studying the brain and the connections between them in the finest detail possible, a process referred to as the parcellation of the brain. The results were published in an expanded version of Nature in July of 2016. Now, there are basically two types of connections within the brain. Structural connectivity refers to the physical connection within the central nervous system. That's what the Human Connectome Project was primarily concerned with. Functional connectivity refers to the correlations among the electrodynamical patterns operating according to nonlinear models. The brain demonstrates network connections at both levels, structural connectivity of neurons and reciprocal interactions of functional electrophysiological processes. This is the neuronal foundation of human experience. But interestingly enough, the parallel structural and functional connectivity is not absolute. While most often it is the case that functional connections do not map 100% directly onto the underlying structural connections. The actual relationship between structural and functional connectivity is complex and a controversial issue. However, research finds that, quote, functional relations exist between regions with no direct structural connection. A recent review concludes that brainwave dynamics, quote, partially reflect, end of quote, underlying neuronal connections, but the brain structure, quote, has not been shown to fully predict the overlying cortical physiology, end of quote. Another study similarly concludes that functional connectivity is constrained but not fully determined by the underlying anatomy. And a large review, carefully nuanced report of the whole findings of this project, right? Our results demonstrate that although functional connectivity reflects structural connectivity to a large degree, there is not a one-to-one mapping. In some, although our data show that resting state functional connectivity reflects structural connectivity, reflects to a large degree, each exists without the other. The structural connectome of the neural fiber bundles is often referred to, especially in popular writings of the brain, as the, quote, wiring diagram of the brain. This impression is reinforced when network diagrams appear on the paper as a series of lines drawn between points. They look very similar to the wiring diagrams I had as a kid building simple radio receivers for kids. A general audience not so familiar with the ways of science may mistake the map for the territory. But as one of the leaders of this project emphasizes, neural networks are not hardwired circuit boards or tightly soldered copper wires. The connectome is constantly remaking itself. New neuronal connections grow stronger, old neuronal connections grow weaker. Meditation, exercise, brain games can cause the cortex to thicken. For example, gaining a new sensory motor ability rather quickly alters the volume of gray matter and the configuration of white matter in the relative sensory motor areas. Age, disease, trauma causes connections to fray. The popular term for this is neuroplasticity. I often say that neuroplasticity is another term for learning. When we learn something new, a foreign language, information about a historical event, a new athletic skill, we reshape our brains, establishing new neuronal patterns. So we must not take the metaphor of the wiring diagram of the brain literally. The connectome is in continual, if subtle, flux. Ritual practices, too, reshape the connectome, and so change our sensory experience and our cognitive processing of it. All this complexifies and nuances any simple claim of localization and the idea that particular cognitive activities can always be neatly mapped onto particular cerebral locales. Rather, it underscores the way in which different brain centers are almost always working together. And that provides some of the neuropsychological grounding for the claim that bodily activity, such as ritual, linked with somatosensory areas, can directly impact and communicate with areas associated with cognition. Part 3, the neuropsychology of our expanded awareness. Often people writing about religious ritual and trance speak of them as generating what they call transcendental experience, by which I assume they mean that these experiences transcend our ordinary experiences. In this culture, the phrase ordinary experience tends to refer to experiences that come through the so-called 5 senses and that are amenable to analysis by formal or abstract rationality. From a neuropsychological standpoint, what might it mean to transcend that ordinary awareness? First, instantiated rationality. A network model emphasizes that all our cognitive processes, including our formal rationality of the kind privileged when modern Western societies speak of, quote, ordinary experience, and their underlying neurological substrates are instantiated in a more encompassing, interconnected neural network that also includes affect and proprioception and a nonlinear interaction among sensory modalities. Research demonstrates that human cognition and behavior involve deep neuronal interconnection between diverse central nervous system domains that include reason, emotion, and sensation, all working together. And the Human Connectome Project not only maps different ways of dividing up the cortex, but at the same time uncovers dense interconnections among these areas. So abstract rationality is embedded rationality, embedded and embraced by a more complex and extended network of sensing, affect, and other bodily processes. This reciprocal interacting network may be one neurological foundation of our capacity to know in ways beyond abstract linear rationality. 2, interacting cognitive subsystems. Another model with similar implications is that of dual interacting cognitive subsystems. There is growing agreement in cognitive psychology that human cognition involves at least 2 subsystems, a mostly, but not entirely unconscious, more intuitive, fast-reacting implicational system, and a slower, more conscious, deliberate, and more linguistic propositional system, in which ratiocination plays a major role. There is also general agreement that the intuitive system provides the assumptions that guide the propositional system's rational activity. This model implies that cognition is more than calculation, and that rational cognition depends upon intuitive, immediate cognition for its governing outlook and presupposition. On the other hand, the implicational intuitive system depends upon the propositional system for the verbal articulation of its insights, although its insights can be expressed by such nonverbal means as art, music, dance, and liturgy. Our colleague Fraser Watts wrote an article in 2016 suggesting that the sense of ineffability that often, but not always, accompanies spiritual experiences arises in part from the attempt to translate experiences originating in the intuitive system into the modes of expression used by the propositional system. This would be another neurological basis for understanding experiences that transcend our ordinary, in our culture, cognition. 3, dual hemisphere. Another neurological foundation for the claim of a larger context in which abstract linear rationality is only a part and not the whole is the dual hemisphere nature of the brain. There was a time when this distinction of the left hemisphere organized for language and linear rationality and the right hemisphere organized for more integrated, intuitive, and artistic processes dominated neurological thinking. By the time I got my training, this oversimplification was being critiqued and rejected. I was taught to be skeptical with good reason of these oversimplifications. But it so often happens historically, this distinction is making a comeback in more complex and nuanced form. For example, Ian McGilchrist, while insisting that both hemispheres are involved in virtually all cognitive activities, argues that the right hemisphere is in fact more contextual, direct, and intuitive. It sees the forest more than the trees, and that it is, quotes, this is McGilchrist, more true to the nature of things. He presents a series of studies that suggest the right hemisphere is more basic and provides the quotes grounded for the left hemisphere's more abstract and decontextualized rationality. This parallels the finding from cognitive psychology that the intuitive implicational cognitive subsystem provides the assumptions that govern the reasoning carried out by the propositional subsystem. For McGilchrist, the more abstract linear left hemisphere activity arises from, and in order to be experienced as compelling, must return to the more basic contextual intuitive knowing of the right hemisphere. Here too, linear rationality, the left hemisphere, can, and according to McGilchrist, should be transcended by being encompassed by experiences arising from the right hemisphere. A similar point was made by our colleague Fraser Watts in 2014. However neurologically formulated, implicit in all these models is the claim that humans have many, more than just two actually, different neurologically grounded ways of perceiving the world and processing information. And that is an important point about human nature that we forget at our peril. This is one of the main arguments in McGilchrist's wide-ranging book. In different ways, all these neurological models suggest that cognitive balance, coherence, realism, and wisdom depend on repositioning ordinary rationality in larger, more encompassing, transcendental, if you wish, experiential and noetic frameworks. Part 4. Some theological implication. I was asked to talk about some of the theological implications of this, so this is for the theologians that are present. Contemporary research demonstrates that bodily activity, including ritual, shapes what we see, what we hear, what we taste, what we sense, and what we experience. 4 implications of this in conclusion for psychology, theology. First, even at the psychophysiological level, human understanding is an incredibly complex phenomenon. Thinking, sensing, feeling, reciprocally influence each other and can even be theorized as aspects of a common neurological process. Bodily activity impacts all 3. Neuroplasticity and the often non-linear cognitivity within various neural networks and the non-linear connection between the functional networks and the brain's anatomy give human nature a certain degree of openness. Experimentation, diagnosis, and treatment development all require simplifying and constraining that openness. But we must never lose sight of the intrinsic complexity and openness built into human nature, even at the neurological level, a point that should be of special interest to theologians. Second, a more complex epistemology. This research calls into question any epistemology that relies on modeling sense experience as a direct, linear, literal representation of external reality. Perception in all sense experiences are much more neurologically and phenomenologically complex than such models allow for, and they are heavily influenced by our embodied state at any moment. Given the complexity of even, quote, simple sensations, there is no evidence here for a simple, direct, representational view of sense experience at the neurological level. Rather, the evidence points to an intrinsic, non-linear openness in the functional operation of the central nervous system. Again, perhaps in some ways analogous to the complexity and openness that is often theorized to characterize the fundamental physics of the physical universe. And any neat separation of cognition, affect, perception, memory, and bodily activity is seriously undermined, except for the purpose of writing undergraduate textbooks. We have argued that human understanding is not simply about formulating amodal, abstract representations about the world. Cognition is not simply about representing the world or holding certain propositions. The post-enlightenment and cognitivist picture is of a mind set apart and over against the world, I guess a little bit like God, which has to then represent the world internally. But human understanding can also be theorized as, first of all, about making one's way in the world as an embodied creature, immersed in a world of experience. Mental representations clearly play a part in this, but they are not at all the whole story. And from a neuropsychological standpoint, human understanding is much more complex than most cognitivist models allow for. And the cognitivist model of religious understanding as consisting only of beliefs is rather oversimplified. And the cognitivist understanding of beliefs themselves is also oversimplified from a neuropsychological standpoint. Third, Cognition can be shifted and transformed by bodily activity. Standing, walking, gesturing, carrying a heavy pack can cause us to think differently and change our perception of ourselves and the world. This has been widely and deeply known for centuries in the religions of the world. The whirling dervishes, the yogic masters, the universal reliance on breathing techniques testify to this. In the West, since the Enlightenment, the tendency has been to separate theory and practice. Nowhere has that done more mischief than in the area of religion. The result has been an almost singular emphasis on belief as the defining characteristic of religion. An embodied model of human knowledge returns beliefs to practices, and therefore underscores that understanding rests on doing. And so it makes sense to claim that ritual practice can give rise to new or transformed religious convictions and moral actions. A final unhappy implication, at least perhaps unhappy, that an intentionally undertaken practice can transform the way in which a person processes information and perceives the world and themselves within it, as well as altering the relevant neuroanatomical structures, has far-reaching epistemological consequences for theology. Spiritual disciplines conceivably make available to their practitioners sources of information and means of processing them in consensually validated ways that are not available to others. Religious knowing is trained and disciplined knowing, in ways analogous to learning to differentiate fine wine or pick up the subtle diagnostic features of an X-ray or a brain scan. Thus, some of the information that serves to make religious beliefs and the religious committed life in total compelling may only be available to those willing to engage in the relevant disciplines. This may be the most controversial and unhappy implications of this discussion of bodily activity and religious experience. Thank you. Now I have, thank you very much. I have a shameless act of self-promotion for a minute. This is my latest book from Oxford University Press on the neuroscience of embodiment's role in religious practice and experience. If you want much more detailed discussion of the research related to this presentation, I have not gone into detail about studies. I think that's the way students of mine call that death by PowerPoint. I've not gone, but if you're particularly interested in this topic and you want to find the research, which in all this is based on studies and research, all of that is available along with some of the larger implications of this work for the psychology of religion and theology in this book. So, shameless act of self-promotion. Okay, questions, comments, cries of pain and outrage. Yes? I've just got to get a pad of paper to write these down because one of my jokes on myself is I used to do research on memory and now I can't remember things. And both of those statements are correct. So.
My question is not directly about religion, but it's definitely involved in discussions as they're happening on the ground. My question was how does the openness and the training and the things, the malleability and the fixity of the mind relate to sexuality in light of religious debates?
I think I have to take a pass on that because I don't know that research, and I have a certain this goes back to actually when I used to lecture all around about terrorism, which I don't. I have sort of three answers to difficult questions. One of them is, this is what I think represents the consensus of the researchers, all right? This is not, there's no consensus here, but this is my professional judgment. I don't know anything about that, and I'm not going to talk about it. And your question falls into the third category. So it's not an area, it's not ethics, it's just I have a professional ethics about this. So I certainly had it when I talked about terrorism, where the world was full of experts on terrorism who knew nothing about it whatsoever. And to some extent, that can be true in neuroscience too. You write in the popular press, people write a lot of stuff about neuroscience. So I really, particularly in this context, which is a professional context, it's a bit of professional, it's a little bit of malpractice. I have insurance for that, but I don't think it covers those kind of things. to stick to what I'm relatively sure-footed about, and that's not. I don't treat patients with issues of that kind, and I don't read the neurological literature about that. It's not to say I'm not interested in human sexuality. Unfortunately, my wife didn't come with me on this trip. Anyways, too much sharing. Other questions, comments, pride? Yes, sir, in the back.
Thank you, very interesting. What my problems with your presentation, your controversial conclusion, is that most in the religious spiritual traditions were about silencing the body, so keeping the body in silence or downplaying the body and its movements and so, both in Western and Eastern traditions. So it seems that it contradicts the basis of your presentation that about body involvement, body cognition. So it seems that for deep mystical religious experience or cognition, you need it rather to disconnect the rest of the body.
Well, two things, okay. First of all, but often that was done by assuming certain postures, and often that was done by breathing techniques, and both of those are profoundly embodied activities in the way that I was talking about. Secondly, even if the body is completely still, and of course the body's never completely still unless you're dead, but the brain is never still if you're alive, and that's partly the thing about so-called resting, resting networks. They're resting because you're not taking on any high-demand cognitive task. But if not, you'd be in a very, very deep coma, and you'd probably be dead if there was no electrical activity going on in your brain. That's brain death by most ethical standards. So yes, certainly it involves stilling the body in our ordinary sense, but sometimes it involves bodily activities, including walking. There's walking meditations, and yoga. Patanjali's Yoga Sutra says the purpose of doing yoga is to quiet the brain, or quiet the mind, rather. So it does involve embodiment, and the brain is always active, even if the body is completely relaxed. Oh, are you gonna?
No, just my peripheral vision. It looked like there was somebody.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. I'm sorry.
That's all right. It's kind of a networks question, and how it might relate to how ritual might reshape brains. I love the Freeman reference because I was amazed by that. Yes. 70s work, but so one of the findings of that study, if I remember correctly, was they were looking at the olfactory neurons in the rabbit when it was sniffing. And when the input sensory neurons began to fire more, it forced the random firing of all the other neurons into kind of a constrained pattern, the limit cycle.
Right, exactly.
And you pointed out that the more that input frequency was, the amplitude was higher, the more constrained that limit cycle was, and maybe also nested. You'd have limit cycles nested within cycles at different frequencies. So when you're engaging in a ritual, there's all sorts of literature on sensory pageantry and all of these things. Could this actually be, at the mechanistic level, the more you're engaging in the ritual with kind of collective effervescence and things like this, the more hierarchical nesting these limit cycles you can get stimulated in the cortex?
What would be the phenomenon in your mind? What would be the? I think you're probably right about that. That makes perfectly good sense. But in your mind, what would be the phenomenological effect of that more nesting? More constrained. Do you have an intuition about that? Because I don't.
Well, I mean, maybe for something not just ritual, but also engaging in hallucinogenics or something like that. You're engaging other sensory things that aren't actually happening in the here and now. And I guess in rituals, there's some symbolic processes that are very arbitrary associations you're making with things. Maybe nesting of hierarchies can include regions of the cortex that aren't usually included in normal experience, and so phenomenologically it feels like an expansion of consciousness. It's just your brain networks are going deeper into their processing, incorporating more networks, something like that.
Well, yeah, I think I suggested something like that, whether, so yeah, that this is an interconnected system, and you can, I assume, although I don't know, I haven't seen brain scans or anything that would, or EEG studies, that how cognizant of that can one be under certain conditions? How conscious of that can one be? And I'm not sure the answer to that. But of course, I think that's part of my point, that there is a kind of dynamic element here, and a nonlinear dynamic element. And that's why I appreciate, by the way, you talking about how what happens is the system gets constrained, because when I talk about this, I don't use the term chaos theory, because it's not chaotic in any sense, except in a very limited sense. It's certainly not chaotic. It's dynamic, but it's constrained, and it's the constraints that partly govern the phenomenological and also the neurophysiological. So I'm just trying to visualize. That's how I think about what that would look like, and what the phenomenological result would be. And so I'm going to think about that some more. So, but it's a very interesting question, and I hope you think about it some more. Yes, sir, you go. Then we'll go in that order.
Okay. Now, I'd like to comment on what Fred Luis Pavietto said about the relationship between the stillness of the body and religious experiences. In most of prayer, the body gets into a posture that's a derivation of submission. So the movement puts you in that submissive-like posture, which from a biological point of view lights up all kind of things in the brain. I mean, submission and dominance are two of the most important aspects of social behavior. So it's the end point of the movement that gets you into the submissive prayer posture.
Okay, but I don't know what your friend would say about this, but I would say.
You would agree.
But is there a further end product of getting into that submissive posture? Is that an end in itself? But I think I suspect that for religious people, that's not, the point is not just to get into a submissive posture, but that has some other phenomenological and so on.
Yes, of course, you think and feel differently when you're in a submissive versus a dominant posture. Big, strong, loud, deep. Yeah. Yes, of course.
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
thank you very much. I thought this was really fascinating. I think I'm going to get hold of your book. So, but my question has to do with, if you're right, then the uncomfortable conclusion that you came to at the end, I'm not quite sure how uncomfortable it is. For example, if, say, a non-believer started going through the motions of certain rituals and things, would you predict that they would become less hostile rather than more hostile to those religious beliefs, just by the nature of the fact that they're going through these motions? So that's one part of the question. And the other part is in many congregations that I've been part of, there are some who enter into it with a heartfelt faith, as it were, and others who just go through the motions because that's the way they've been brought up. So I just wondered what impact that might have in relation to how effective those movements or rituals are in those individuals. In other words, is there a kind of slippage at all in terms of does going through those motions actually change or shape the way they think about their religious practice or not?
I'll do the second one first, and then you'll have to remind me first. Okay, there's been a research project in the psychology of religion, since the 50s. It goes back and forth about two ways of being religious, what he called intrinsic and extrinsic. And that the intrinsic is the person who undertakes, who belongs to some religious group as an end in itself. And the extrinsic is the person who undertakes some kind of religious activity for extrinsic reasons. It's a common distinction in personality psychology. And that feels like something like the distinction you're playing on. There's a lot of research about that. Virtually all of the positive effects. for example, in terms of the health benefits, which is something I particularly know something about, of religious practice, involve the intrinsic practitioner and not necessarily the extrinsic practitioner. And so, if somebody comes and hears me lecture about the benefits of religious practice for health psychology, if some pastor or rabbi or something comes here and say, well, now I'm going to say it's good for your health, that's an extrinsic motivation, and it won't, quote, work that way. So I think that just simply engaging in any activity for an extrinsic motivation is not going to produce psychological change. That seems pretty much the result of this research, not just in religion, but in other activities too, athletics, for example. The question, I mean, your first question is really about conversion, right? I mean, what is it that causes a person to change their mind about religious things, or other things for that matter? And I don't think that simply engaging in a practice, because that's such a complicated thing. I mean, it's got, for exactly these reasons, it's got cognitive dimension, it's got affective dimension, it's got behavioral dimensions, it's got all of those things. And so I would not suggest that a person simply engaging in a ritual, just that by itself. But I mean, obviously there are reports in the conversion literature that suggest otherwise, and I don't know any large-scale studies. I do know a study that was done of meditation, and it was done in a purely secular context. It was done for stress management for medical students, because medical students are pretty stressed out, and they engaged in a kind of meditation practice. There's a whole literature about this too. For stress, and there was no religious teaching involved in this at all. But the researchers added a religious scale to the study, pre-test, post-test, and follow-up. And they discovered that even when people engaged in this very secular meditation practice for purely secular motivations, in fact, a significant, statistically significant majority of people had a statistically significant increase in their interest in spirituality and spiritual outlook and so on and so forth. And so that certainly suggests something like what you're suggesting. It's one study, and I don't know whether that's been replicated in any ways. It wasn't the purpose of the study. The purpose of the study was to study stress management. So I don't know of any good studies that would answer that in a way that I could be sure-footed about it. But there's no question that in the sort of autobiographical literature of religious conversion, there's no question that people have experiences exactly like what you say, that they start engaging in some practice in many different religious traditions, and they find that it changes. And of course that makes sense to me, because if you start doing something different, the way you think and experience things is going to change too. And it doesn't happen 100% of the time, obviously. And it's something as complicated as religious conversion. It's almost, from a psychological standpoint, it's never down to just one cause. It's never just one thing that does it. If you really unpack it carefully, particularly in a kind of clinical context. But so I can't say, yeah, this will guarantee to work, but there's reason to think that, at least for some people, it has that effect. That's the kind of generalization that's not very helpful, right? Because but human behavior is very complicated, right? I mean, human behavior is very complicated, at least for a clinical person like myself. Psychologists complain about how psychology is not a science like physics, But from my perspective, I used to have a reasonably good amateur status in physics. I don't have it anymore. It's going past what I used to know. But human behavior is much more complicated in the way I would use the word complexity than even the most complex physics. So the number of variables involved. So it's hard to predict. It's hard to predict outside of very constrained circumstances. Now, of course, it gets very predictable. But you get outside of those constrained circumstances, it gets a lot less predictable. Yes?
Just to combine so the first part of your question, which was talking about atheists attending, and would they convert by fitting part of ritual. You're suggesting that in ritual giving rise to religion, but it doesn't say this is a one-to-one relationship, but it increases the probability, sort of fake it till you make it kind of thing. Or is it something a little bit more, something else that's going on? Or is
well, that's a different question, right? If there's something else besides us going on, is somebody else minding the store too? That's a theological question. I'll leave that with theologians in the room for the moment. The fake it till you make it is complicated, because if you're willing to fake something until you make it, you're already 3/4 of the way there, right? I mean, you only take that as a kind of deepening process for something that you're already pretty well. You don't start from zero and undertake. At least I can't imagine that you'd undertake a sort of cognitive practice, or a practice like that based on that kind of cognition, unless you already wanted it. You're already interested in it, you're already involved in it, you're already 3/4 of the way there. So if you have, I don't think it's good. I don't think there's any ritual practice you can plop a hardcore, reductive, materialist atheist in the middle of, and they're going to change their worldview simply on the basis of that. The issue of what it takes for people to change their basic worldview is a very, very tricky, very, very difficult. And it's a hard thing, and it's a hard thing. It's a hard thing to do. It's a hard thing to ask yourself. It's a hard thing to do. There was another hand up, and I lost. Yeah.
Maybe something before. Okay.
Maybe you should do this.
Chris, just a bit of anecdotal evidence. Not about adults, but about children, because I'm possibly the only person here who is in a religious tradition which actually is very physical, very ritualistic, which is Eastern Orthodox.
And
it's very interesting to see how children, long before they have any conceptual understanding of what they're doing, if they're brought up to take aside the cross, light a candle in front of an icon, do the prostrations of Lent and so on, it does seem to have an extraordinary effect on the way in which, it's not indoctrination of people saying this is the truth and that's error. It's actually something much more complex, but the physical element of it does seem to be quite important.
Absolutely, no. It's someone who used to teach developmental psychology, particularly the developmental psychology of religion. I mean, you're absolutely right, and it's partly, at least I would say, based on some developmental. Children are much, of course, their level of cognitive complexity of the average, first, second grade kid is not great, right? To try to talk to them about the doctrine of the Trinity or the meaning of emptiness in Buddhism or something like that. But what they're sensitive to. And this often, when I've often lectured on this to groups of religious people, or particularly religious pastors and rabbis and so on and so forth, they get a little shaken up by this. But what kids pick up on, it's true in families, as it is in churches and synagogues and mosques and ashrams and so on, is that kids are exquisitely sensitive to the emotional tenor of what's going on. So if you have a congregation where they talk about love all the time, but everybody's angry at everybody else, or you have a family where they talk about love all the time, but everybody's angry at all, what will kids walk away from? They won't walk away from elementary school age kids. What will they walk away from? They'll associate religion with anger or bitterness or judgmentalism, if that's the emotional tenor. So yes, and of course, again, for all kinds of reasons, exactly what you say, the kids are much more, you somehow train this out of it. They're much more sensitive to the non-verbal. So yes, ritual, colorful, music, dance, colorful ritual activity, that will engage kids, elementary school age kids. Teaching them about, some theological, philosophical topic will not do it. I think that's right. Well, I think that's, yeah, I agree with you, Chris. And I have good reason to agree with you. I mean, I think what you're saying makes sense in terms of what we know about developmental psychology. When it gets into adulthood, then of course, then the issue of cognitive complexity comes in. And the issue of cognitive complexity is complex, no pun intended. And the issue of cognitive complexity in relation to religion is particularly complex because it takes a certain, I would argue, a certain high, it takes a high degree of cognitive complexity to understand things like emptiness in Buddhism or the Trinity in Christianity or other kinds of things. That's not why, I don't know about Britain, but in the United States, cognitive complexity is not widely distributed in the population. So that becomes a problem. There's research about that too. I mean, I say that a lot because if I'm going to talk about something, I want to say there's some research about it. There's a fair amount of good research about cognitive complexity. In any case, that's not what I'm here to talk about. So, yes?
Yeah, just to follow up on that, like, is there any evidence that there's a difference between the cognitive plasticity with children and older people?
Oh yes, no. It's pretty well mapped out that there are, I don't like the word stages, but that's the word that's used in the literature, that there are stages, and there are stages that are more concrete, is the word that's usually used, which has to do with simply dealing with what's in front of you and not having much meta-awareness of that. And then there are other stages that have to do with having more meta-awareness and then being critical of it. And that's usually called formal reasoning, but not having to do with wearing a tuxedo to the formal hall, but to thinking in terms of form, like mathematics is the example, because it's fairly formal. And then there's post-formal reasoning, which doesn't get into the discussion much. But it turns out there's interesting research about post-formal reasoning and religion. That's the post-formal reasoning is the capacity to not only reason about something in a formal way, say in a mathematically formal way, but to be able to stand back from that and be critical and evaluative of the gains and losses of thinking about things in formal ways. And that's called post-formal reasoning. And it turns out that that's not very widely distributed in the population at all, but that there's no difference in the studies, and I know some of you know this person too, but I'm not going to talk about him at this moment. There's done a lot of studies about this. There's no difference really population-wise between religious believers as a group and atheists as a group in terms of formal and post-formal reasoning. And most atheists don't like that because they want to think that they're brighter than other people. But in fact, in those populations, since we were talking about atheists and conversion, I'm bringing this up this is a huge literature. I mean, it's courses and courses of literature on cognitive development and formal reasoning and post-formal reasoning.
I just brief follow-up. Is there a difference in plasticity? Like, are older people less prone to change, to convert, to look for other experiences?
I don't know the answer to that. I don't know. I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah. Yes, in terms of likelihood of conversion, I have no idea.
I mean, one of the nice things about a conference of this size is precisely from questions originally addressed to the speaker, we can get into subsequent groups and so on. I'm standing up for the obvious reason that if we were to stop now, it just gives people more 10 minutes or so to get back to their rooms before dinner. And I would say that was great. That was exactly the sort of start to this conference, Jim. Really appreciate it. Thank you very much.